over Jerusalem, you can find the ruins of tombs from the time of Jesus Christ. Some are unmarked and unknown and unvisited by tourists, but if you know where they are and you can find them on Urban Explorer websites and so on, you can explore them. And some of them even have their rolling stones still intact. I love to explore these because it helps me picture this story. Picture Peter and John running to a tomb like one of these. The Gospel of John describes their foot race. It says that although Peter lost the race to the tomb, he actually went in first. Classic, impulsive Peter. And he sees the empty tomb, but he can't quite bring himself to believe that Jesus is alive. He's still puzzling it out. Why doesn't he believe Jesus is resurrected when Christ said he would be? I think it's interesting that Peter actually saw the empty tomb, but he apparently couldn't quite bring himself to believe that Jesus is alive yet. The Gospels say he's still sort of puzzling it out at this point. And even when he sees Jesus alive again in the upper room in Jerusalem, he still doesn't say much for once. Why? Well, I think he felt stupid and ashamed. He was so disappointed in himself. He felt guilty. His belief was hampered by his feeling of failure. Even if Jesus is alive again, he feels like he's surely going to reject me because the last time I saw this person face to face, I cursed and denied him. I was unfaithful, unreliable, untruthful. And in fact, after a few days, Peter says to the other disciples, you know what? I'm going fishing. I'm moving back up to Galilee. In other words, he's saying, I quit. Because he figures he's totally disqualified. And so Peter goes back to his old job, fishing, and he drags all the other disciples along with them. He's kind of a born leader. They just follow him back up here to the place where it all started 3 eventful years earlier, the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And they find what was probably their old boat from 3 years ago. And they climb into it, and they try their hand at their old job fishing. And Peter is a failure even at that. After a long night fishing, he has caught nothing. And it's early morning, and I imagine it being a little misty, and the light is dim, and suddenly a man they can't make out on shore yells out, "Hey boys, how'd the fishing go last night?" And I imagine Peter being a little bit irritated as he yells back, "Terrible. Catch anything? No." And then that man that they can't quite make out says, "Why don't you try the other side of the boat?" That brings back an interesting memory from 3 years before. They flip the nets over to the other side, and instantly their boat is nearly capsized with all the fish that rush into the net. "It's the Lord," yells John, and Peter, ever impulsive, kind of cannonballs into the water and swims to the shore. And John 21:9 picks up the story. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. They saw a fire that Jesus had been making for them. He'd already been cooking them breakfast. Now it says a fire made of coals. Why would the writer specify that? Check this out. I think this is just such a beautiful part of the story. The Greek word anthrakia, from which we get our English word anthracite, meaning a charcoal fire, is the word that's used there in that verse. And it's found only twice in the whole New Testament. The second time is in this verse, John 21:9. The first time is John 18:18, where that word is used to describe the courtyard fire around which Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Do you know how smells can bring back memories? For me, the smell of campfires equals summer vacation. For me, the smell of coffee equals morning. The smell of popcorn equals movies. But for Peter, the smell of a charcoal fire like this equaled failure. In fact, the biggest failure of his life. And I think Jesus builds a charcoal fire here as if to say, hey, Peter, smell that? Remember another fire a few days back in Jerusalem? Well, why don't we rebrand that experience and so it doesn't haunt you? And when they had finished eating the breakfast that Jesus had cooked for them all, and again, I love that detail, Jesus kind of puts his arm around Peter and takes him aside a little bit, and he asks him one simple question 3 times. Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Not, Peter, will you try harder next time? Not, Peter, do you promise not to disappoint me again? Not even, Peter, do you finally understand what I was trying to tell you? No. Do you love me? Jesus was asking Peter what to him is the most important question of all. And if you and I don't understand that that is the question Jesus is asking us, that is the question that is important to Jesus when it comes to our relationship with him, when it comes to our Christian discipleship, growing in our love for him, then you will always assume, listen to me carefully here, that Jesus is evaluating you based on your performance, which is terrible because that'll either lead you to despair as a Christian or to quitting as a Christian. Because just like Peter, you and I will fail. We will fail repeatedly. And I think Peter quit being a disciple of Jesus and went back to his old life, back to fishing, precisely because he still thought that way. Even a little bit, because after all, he had bragged to Jesus that he, Peter, would prove himself worthy, that he would be strong. And then when he fails in that vow, he just assumes Jesus is going to reject him. But what Jesus is saying with this question is, Peter, you have nothing to prove to me. You don't have to impress me. You don't have to earn anything from me. You just have to love me and then grow as you understand my love for you. So when Peter does insist that he loves Jesus 3 times, and then Jesus says, feed my sheep, again, 3 times. Why do you love me 3 times? Why feed my sheep 3 times? Well, I think he asks him that question and then gives him that mission once for every time Peter denied Jesus. 1, 2, 3. In other words, Peter, you've benched yourself. Get off the bench and get back in the game. You know what blows my mind? Here's the risen Jesus with resurrection power, like walking through walls power, appearing in the middle of a group power. I mean, he could have gone anywhere, done anything with that power. But what he chooses to do is to find Peter and to restore him. Because that, in the end, is how Jesus always uses his power. He came to use his divine power to seek and save the lost, to redeem failures like Peter and like you and like me. And isn't it strategic that Jesus chooses a spot like this? I mean, maybe it was this very beach here on the shores of the Sea of Galilee to reinstate Peter. He could have just done this in the upper room up in Jerusalem. I'm sure it was because Jesus was communicating, look, Peter, I called you out of being a fisherman when you were fishing in a boat on this very lake shore 3 years ago, and now, knowing all that I do about you, now, after all the foot in mouth moments, now after all the cursing moments, now after all the denial moments, I would do it again. I chose you then, I choose you still, and I will never unchoose you. Do you ever feel like you've disqualified yourself from being a Christian? Then spend some time listening to the voice of Jesus speaking to you. What's he saying? Do you love me? Then come on, let's keep walking together. Jesus chose you, and he will never unchoose you. Aren't you glad? That's one of the things you will discover again and again as you follow Jesus step by step through all the ups and all the downs, just like Peter.